everyone. This video is to serve the purpose in supporting you in your cell metabolism review flowcharts, which comprise of both the photosynthesis flowchart as well as the cellular respiration flowchart. So as we know, photosynthesis occurs in plants, but specifically, it occurs in the leaf of plants. When we're looking at the leaf, photosynthesis as a process actually takes place in the chloroplast of the leaf. But within the chloroplast, these are these specially made pigments that are green that are called chlorophyll. And that's super important because this pigment allows the leaf to absorb sunlight, which is that energy source for life. And in photosynthesis, there are two very specific stages. There's the light reaction, or the light-dependent reaction, which requires light. And then there's the dark reaction, which is also known as the light-independent reaction, which does not require light. However, they work together to take what photosynthesis brings in and creates the outputs of photosynthesis. So the first stage of the photosynthesis is called the light reaction. And this light reaction occurs in the thylakoid. This stage requires two very specific things. It requires sunlight, that energy source for all living things. And it also requires water, or H2O. And once this part of photosynthesis, or the stage of photosynthesis, takes in water and sunlight, it breaks that water and sunlight into three distinct different pieces. It releases electrons. It breaks it down into hydrogen ions, or hydrogen. And it also releases a gas that's really important to us in breathing, which is called oxygen gas. Now, what happens is when we break these down into oxygen gas, hydrogen, and electron, we have to store these molecules on some electron carriers. Those two electron carriers are that charged battery called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, as well as NADPH, okay, right here. We're going to come back to these two things because the dark reaction uses these two things, and then its empty or its dead version has to be recharged, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Now, the second stage of photosynthesis is called the dark reaction, or the dark independent reaction. This stage occurs in the stroma, and it releases it does not release a gas. It takes in a gas, and this gas comes from the atmosphere, which is called carbon dioxide. So CO2. Now, I want you to think about this real quick. These three things combine during the dark reaction to make the final product. So we're talking about ATP, NADPH, and carbon dioxide. Well, we need to produce an energy source, and then in cellular respiration, we're going to use that energy source, and that energy source is called glucose. The chemical formula for that is C6H12O6. Well, where'd that oxygen come from? Right here. Where'd that carbon come from? Right here in CO2. Now we're missing hydrogen. Where did that hydrogen come from? From the light reaction, or that NADPH. Now, once we use that H here, what do we have? NADP. So once we use the H off of the NADPH, it's going to go over here, and it's going to go back to the light reaction to be recharged. So NADP+, and it's carrying those electrons. It's going to take energy to put these things together, and that's why we're going to have to release that energy by popping that phosphate off. Once we pop one of those phosphates off, it's no longer adenosine triphosphate. It's now adenosine diphosphate. Okay? So the things that go into photosynthesis are carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water. And they are transformed into oxygen, glucose, and these beautiful little electron carriers right here, NADP and ADP. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to move on to the cellular respiration side of it. And this is typically where people get a little bit more confused, but this flowchart should help you in your understanding. When we are looking at cellular respiration, this occurs not only in plant cells, but it also occurs in animal cells, okay? And here's a word bank to help you out. In cellular respiration, it is the exact opposite in terms of chemical formula as photosynthesis. So we are going to take the energy made in photosynthesis and transform it. So in cellular respiration, we take glucose and we are going to break it down into an energy that we can use, which is ATP. The very first step of cellular respiration is called glycolysis. And in glycolysis, we have to spend money to make money, much like an investment on a business. Glycolysis takes 2 ATP to get started. However, it makes a total of 4 ATP. If we have made 4 ATP, but we have a debt of 2, that means we're going to make 2 ATP here. By the way, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. 2 ATP isn't that much. That's why we need to move on to figure out if we are going to take our highway or back roads, okay? After glycolysis, we have to figure out if oxygen is first available or is oxygen not available. If oxygen is available, we're able to utilize that glucose in a more efficient manner. It's much more like a highway. We're going to get to point A to point B much faster than we would if we went through an anaerobic process or something without oxygen. Let's go ahead and start with cellular respiration. If there is oxygen, it is known as an aerobic respiration. Aerobic means with oxygen. And the process is cellular respiration. There are 2 steps in cellular respiration following glycolysis, and that is called the Krebs cycle and the ETC, or the electron transport chain. Both of these are more efficient because they use oxygen. When we use oxygen, we call this form of respiration aerobic, like aerobic exercises. And the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain leave the cytoplasm, and if there's oxygen, it occurs in the mitochondria. And we all know what the mitochondria does. It makes energy for the cell. You guys will go to your grave knowing that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. But what's really cool is when we are able to go through this form of cellular respiration, because there's oxygen, we go from glycolysis with 2 ATPs to the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. We are able to make, if everything lines up perfectly, 34 ATP for the cell. Now, if after we have that one glucose molecule, we go through glycolysis, we make our 2 ATP, and there's not oxygen, we're not going to be able to take the highway. There's an obstacle in our way. We're not going to make energy quite as efficiently, but we will still make energy. If there is not oxygen, we can't go through cellular respiration. After glycolysis, we cannot go to the Krebs cycle. We cannot go into the mitochondria. However, we can stay in the cytoplasm and we're able to go through a process called fermentation. Fermentation does not require oxygen, so therefore we call it anaerobic. And remember, the prefix ana means without. Aerobic means water, oxygen, so without oxygen respiration. And because we don't have oxygen, we can't leave the cytoplasm. We cannot go into the mitochondria, so we are going to stay stuck in the cytoplasm. Now, when we do fermentation, two types of cells, this is very common in, yeast cells as well as muscle cells. When it happens in yeast cells, we call it alcoholic fermentation. And its products are ethanol or alcohol, as well as CO2, carbon dioxide. This is actually what gives certain beverages their carbonation, or those bubbles. It's the yeast cells eating that glucose or that sugar, and as a result, in eating that sugar, it produces alcohol as well as carbon dioxide, and that's how those are carbonated. Now, in muscle cells, this is what happens when you do not have enough oxygen going to your muscles. We've all been running or working out, and we get a cramp. The best thing to do for those cramps is to stretch it out and to get oxygen there. When this happens in oxygen, in muscle cells, we call this lactic acid fermentation. And what is the product of this? Super easy, lactic acid. So, what's the difference? Both of these, both fermentation as well as cellular respiration, make ATP. However, if there is oxygen after glycolysis, we're able to go to the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and make 34 ATP. If there is not oxygen after glycolysis, we don't make any ATP. We either make alcohol and carbon dioxide or lactic acid, but we did make 2 ATP. And that's why I call this the highway. It's a lot more efficient. This, we're going to have some obstacles or some bumps along the way. If you guys have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. Your teachers are here for you. I hope this helps.